In 2024, the Delta Farmland and Wildlife Trust launched a cover crop variety demonstration trial as part of the BC Living Labs project, comparing several fall-planted species to support growers in the region. We took a look at the project and reported on the results of the 2024 trial and checked in on the progress of the ongoing 2025 trial.
Hi, my name is April Stainsby and I'm a program coordinator with the Delta Farmland and Wildlife Trust. So at Delta Farmland and Wildlife Trust, one of the main things we do is support farmers in growing cover crops. We've been supporting farmers in growing cover crops for the last 30 years, and we get asked a lot of questions about what people should grow. We also use local information about cover crops to inform how we run our programs. So having current information about how different types of cover crops grow on local fields is really valuable to us. So in 2024, we planted a cover crop trial, and for that trial, we were looking for cover crops that might perform well in a vegetable cropping system. So we were looking for cover crops that would grow quickly and cover the ground and be good for weed suppression, and also different varieties to add diversity to the mix. And so we planted 20 different plots. We planted them late August, early September, and we monitored them for how well they grew over the winter. We were really interested to see how well they grew initially, but also which ones would survive the winter and how much residue they would have in the spring.
The Delta Farmland and Wildlife Trust grew 20 different plots of both varieties commonly used in the region, along with a few unusual varieties and blends, including lone cereals, cereal mixes, clovers, soil compaction busters like tillage radish, pollinator mixes, nitrogen fixes, and blends for dairy systems.
We monitored the plots over the winter. So initially we were monitoring them for how well they were growing. So we measured how tall each variety was, and we measured the percent cover, because something farmers are really interested in is how quickly the cover crop will cover the ground or have canopy closure. And then we also measured weediness, also using percent cover. And we also looked for signs of waterfowl grazing. So we did that throughout the fall regularly, and then we did it in November, January, and March. In the 2024 trial, we were really happy with most of the varieties. They grew really well initially. There was just a couple that didn't grow very well, and they weren't big surprises. There was a couple more sort of warm season annuals we grew, like sorghum and sun hemp, and those didn't grow at all, which wasn't a shock. And the buckwheat grew really well initially, but died off pretty quickly in late September. But most of the other things did really well. The cereals did really well, the brassicas, a lot of the mixes, grew really well. We looked at them in mid-January, and because we hadn't had any really cold weather yet, most of them looked really good. But the ones that really stood out were the triticale and the fava beans. So triticale was still tall and green and seemed to be growing nicely compared to the other cereals, which still looked fine. And then the fava beans were really nice and green and flowering, which was just kind of surprising to see in the middle of the winter. They looked really happy. They were about maybe 2 feet tall. Some things had mostly died off at that point, like the sunflowers were mostly gone, the peas were gone, the buckwheat obviously was gone, and the clovers were also mostly gone. I think there was a lot of water on the field, like I said, so all these things were being tested in really, really wet conditions. So we monitored the plots again in mid-March, and we were looking for residue because we're really interested in how much residue is left to cover the soil in the spring. And so, not surprisingly, the only cover crop plots that were still alive were the 2 winter cereals, the winter wheat and the fall rye. And the winter wheat was doing a lot better than the fall rye. It seemed to tolerate the wet conditions better. Everything else was dead. Cereals had the most residue that was left. Of the non-cereals, the most residue was from the fava beans and the phacelia.
Even though many of the crops had died back, the residue left behind still provides real value. The remaining plant material adds organic matter to the soil, helps retain nutrients, and protects the soil's surface from erosion.
So the intention behind this trial was to have a demonstration of how different types of cover crops grow in these really specific local conditions, so that growers who are in the area can see how these perform on a real farm field. So it is very specific in that way, but these different types of cover crops, you can also see how they grow, kind of what they look like, what they do, and that could also be relevant to other growers.
This demonstration trial ran through the winter, but included a fall field day that gave growers a chance to observe cover crop establishment. The trial wrapped with a written report released the following spring. The intention behind both, to simply present the results so that growers could draw their own conclusions from the observations. And in 2025, the trial continued and expanded with a few key differences.
In 2025, we decided to do a cover crop trial again. And so we did this because you never know with 1 year, there's so many differences between years. But this year we also made a few changes. So we tried a few different varieties. So last year at the cover crop trial, we talked to growers who came and they had some suggestions for other things they'd like to see. So for example, this year we tried mustard, which is growing really well, which is something people are interested in for biofumigation potential. We also tried annual ryegrass, and this year we tried some different clovers. The 2 last year died out, so we just tried 2 other clovers that are supposed to be maybe more water tolerant. We also included some different mixes this year. The other things we did different this year is we tried different starting dates. And so planting date's really key for cover crops because they're planted after the cash crop. Sometimes depending on when you harvest, cover crops can have limited time to grow.
At the time of filming, the trial is still underway and the results are not finalised. But the late January report is that everything grew well, barring some interesting waterfowl grazing patterns observed at the Delta site.
The other big difference we made this year is we seeded a second trial out in Abbotsford in the Sumas Prairie, also on a vegetable farm. And it's pretty different out there in terms of the soil. So our site there is really sandy, the climate's a bit different, the growing practice is a bit different. So we really wanted to get a sense of how things work there and just see how all the different cover crops perform out there, and then also be able to have people come and see them and get ideas from it.
The plots at the Abbotsford site grew well, and in late January, most were still growing. A handful of plots were starting to winter kill, but were mostly still green. There hasn't been any grazing observed at this location. Overall, these trials provide a practical look at how different cover crops perform under local field conditions, giving growers the opportunity to make their own observations and decisions. Results from the 2025 trial will be released in spring 2026. For updates and additional resources, visit Delta Farmland and Wildlife Trust.